Thank you, Christine. Today I will be talking about dryland livelihood systems and nutrition. First, I would like to look back at the original malnutrition causality framework to consider what role livelihoods might have played. And shown here on the right is an extract of the basic causes from that original framework. And the net nutrition strategy, the narrative that accompanies that framework, emphasized production systems and systems thinking, as shown in that quote there that's drawn from that strategy. This interest coincided with a wider development policy shift towards sustainable livelihoods that I'm sure you're all familiar with. However, within the field of nutrition, this interest was soon to be overtaken by a rapid expansion of emergency nutrition from the 90s onwards, which was followed in the past decade by a well-defined, more action-oriented focus on the immediate and underlying causes and the essential actions that we know well today. Now, a key aspect of the original framework that I want to emphasize is the role of formal and informal institutions. However, 2 years after this was published in 1992, that edition of the framework, institutions were removed, and to my knowledge, they've not reappeared since. But as we learned from our webinar last week, systems and institutions remain crucially important to livelihoods and nutrition. Next slide, please. So moving on to consider the unique characteristics of livelihood systems that are adapted to Africa's drylands. Obviously, there is a long history of livelihood adaptation to variability, as we heard from our first webinar speakers. And I just want to emphasize that much can be learned from pastoralists and other dryland producers whose specialist livelihood strategies enable them to take advantage of the environmental variability of drylands in order to improve their production. In other words, they work with variability rather than against it, and they have relatively low inputs and make a limited impact on the environment. Next slide, please. This long-term process of successful adaptation is the reason why specialist livelihood systems are fundamentally resilient. Their specialist skills and experience in responding to variability and managing dryland resources are adapted to what outsiders might consider to be the harsh conditions associated with drylands. So moving on to talk about vulnerability, which I've framed as livelihood, sorry, if we can go back to the last slide. Thank you. Livelihood precarity and persistent acute malnutrition. We're all aware that worsening conditions linked to persistent climate shocks, protracted conflict, sudden economic downturns, combined or in combination with poor governance or weak or failing institutions, have undermined these adapted livelihood systems, their resilience, and increased the precarity of livelihoods. And I pulled out a few examples that I think are pretty common, like the privatization of the commons and the practices that are linked to resource extraction. We heard about the inequalities that are exacerbated in times of crisis. For example, in times of crisis, we often see coping strategies which increase the risk and vulnerability of women in particular. Insecurity and conflict is frequently a problem at multiple levels and of increasing complexity, whether this is localized farmer-herder conflict or civil conflict between armed forces. And I also wanted to mention COVID-19. That has particular implications for local livelihoods. As we all know, the poor cannot afford to limit their social interaction and must work in order to feed themselves. If we want to understand how livelihoods impact nutrition, we first need to understand how livelihood systems work. Next slide, please. Over the past 2 decades, we've learned much from livelihoods analysis. And one of the things we've learned is that we need to look beyond what people do for a living, what they produce, what they earn, and instead look deeper into what they require to do this. Now, livelihood resources are a big part of the answer to that question. And for farming, this means access to farmland, pastoralism, it might be seasonal pastures, forest products, water, but they also need relevant skills, experience, and a range of other resources. But often when we ask producers these questions, they very quickly look beyond the resource itself to talk about their relationship to it and how this is managed. For example, through fairer land tenure regimes, access to financial services, open migratory routes for animals, water resources in the dry season, access to land for women, and the list goes on. And also increasingly in conflict settings, people will prioritize security and protection as essential for their livelihood. Now, all of these things fall under the domain of formal and informal institutions. So if we want to understand how livelihood systems work and their resilience and their impact on nutrition, we really need to think about institutions. Next slide, please. And anyway, to sum up, what people do depends on their access to resources, which in turn are mediated or governed by institutions. Addressing the basic drivers of malnutrition calls for a more systemic approach, strengthening these same livelihood systems and their institutions, which uphold nutrition and address the underlying drivers of malnutrition. So this approach is less about what to do, the intervention that addresses the underlying causes, and more about the process of systemic and institutional change, and a focus on livelihoods that reflects locally led priorities. Finally, with my last slide, I want to share some reflections on research and learning on livelihoods, which I think are very relevant to addressing malnutrition. And I have three main points. Next slide, please. And thank you. So first of all, an emphasis on locally led learning, which means proactively working with stakeholders and their institutions. And I really want to mention here the importance of empowering and capacity building local researchers and their institutions based on the latest evidence and understanding. And the importance of identifying research gaps, which would lead to a more demand-led research and learning process, not one driven by fashion. Finally, under locally led learning, I think we need to consider something we heard last week. I've framed it in terms of grasping the nettle, which means kind of putting ourselves outside of our comfort zone. And we have to do that if we're going to extend our own learning and embrace new ideas or approaches. Last week, for example, we heard that we must consider power as well as vulnerability. And I think those raise difficult questions for a lot of us. Moving on, we often talk about best mixed methods, and I really want to emphasize we must use the best tools for the job and tailor the methods to the research questions and not the other way around. And this means looking beyond the standard qualitative and quantitative approaches to explore more participatory and innovative approaches. And we heard a lot of examples of those, again, in our earlier webinars. I also stress historical perspectives and the need to pay more attention to long-term trends and seasonality in our methods. And finally, a comment on the role for RCTs, randomized controlled trials, often thought of as, and rightly so, as the gold standard. They are obviously important, but I would argue only at the end of the learning process to validate approaches that have been designed on the basis of formative research and learning. Finally, I want to emphasize the role for research uptake as part of a process of systemic and institutional change, which might include participation and consultation from the very start of the learning process, capacity building that is two-way and recognizes the strengths, resources, skills, and experience of all actors and builds capacities and collaboration based on this. And finally, I think we need to build a shared commitment to addressing acute malnutrition by first ensuring a shared understanding, which requires a locally adapted conceptual framework that stakeholders can relate to and contribute to. Thank you. Over to you, Christine.